The laundry room smelled like bleach and industrial heat. Megan O'Brien folded a fitted sheet with the precision of someone who'd once sutured a femoral artery in the dark. Her hands moved on their own, each crease deliberate, each corner tucked with the muscle memory of 47 field surgeries. The tremor came only when she stopped moving. When her fingers stilled on the warm cotton, the slight shake appeared, barely visible, the kind only someone trained to notice would catch. She pressed the sheet flat. Breathed. Started the next one. 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial in Raleigh. 3 years of fabricated credentials, quiet shifts, and the kind of invisibility that came from never making eye contact with doctors long enough for them to see her clearly. The pediatric ICU suited her. Children didn't ask questions. They didn't care if a nurse's hands bore scars that didn't match any civilian accident. They just needed someone to hold their hand when the monitors beeped in that particular way that meant the end was coming. She reached for another sheet. The laundry cart sat half full, white fabric tumbling in the dryer behind her like snow. Outside these walls, Raleigh moved through another Tuesday. Traffic. Lunch orders. People living the kind of lives where a single mistake didn't end with an official record erased from every government database. The dog tag hung beneath her scrubs, hidden where only she could touch it. One tag. Broken chain. The metal was warm against her chest from the laundry room heat. She'd never taken it off, not in 3 years. Not since the Pentagon liaison had found her in a safe house outside Quantico and told her the only way to stay alive was to become someone else. Major Megan O'Brien didn't exist anymore. She was just Megan now. Just a pediatric ICU nurse with a quiet voice and steady hands. Her phone buzzed. She didn't check it. The phone only buzzed during emergencies, and emergencies meant complications, and complications meant people noticed you. Better to fold sheets. Better to move through Oak Creek Memorial like she was part of the infrastructure, like she'd been built into the walls. The intercom crackled to life somewhere down the corridor. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Not her patient. She kept folding. At 7:42 a.m., Colonel James Hartley pushed through the pediatric ICU's double doors with a pronounced limp that caught on the left side. His cane struck the tile floor with a sound like a metronome counting down. He wore civilian clothes, charcoal slacks, a button-down shirt stretched tight across the kind of chest that came from 2 decades of service, but the military posture was impossible to hide. His jaw could cut glass. His eyes moved in tactical sweeps, assessing exits and sight lines like the hallway might contain threats. He was supposed to start consulting on Daniel's case at 8 o'clock. The chief of staff had called him 3 weeks ago when the first signs of his son's hearing complications emerged. He should see a specialist, they'd suggested. Colonel Hartley had other priorities. He'd rearranged his entire morning to be here instead, which meant something in the hospital's latest reports had concerned him enough to move his schedule. The kind of concern that only a father and a Green Beret colonel could carry in the same breath. He stopped at the nurse's station. Checked the pediatric census board. His fingers traced Daniel's name, room for 12, pediatric observation, and his jaw tightened. The limp was from a compound fracture he'd received in Marja 6 years ago. Megan knew this because Marja was where she'd last seen Colonel Hartley breathing, where she'd performed an emergency thoracotomy with a combat knife and her hands were steady and his unit had called her angel and told her she'd just saved everyone. 6 years. A lifetime. She was in the laundry room. He had no reason to know she existed. Megan came out of the back corridor at 7:58 a.m. carrying an armload of fresh linens. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to occupy space without claiming any of it. The sheets were pressed, the gowns folded, the supplies organized in a way that meant nothing would ever be out of place. She was walking past the nurse's station when Colonel Hartley turned from the census board. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. He stopped. Actually stopped, the way a machine stops when it encounters an error in its programming. His right hand dropped from the desk. His breathing shifted. She saw the moment recognition tried to form on his face, not full recognition, because Major Megan O'Brien was dead, was supposed to be dead, was officially non-existent, but the beginning of it. The neural pathway firing. The memory trying to surface. Megan's fingers brushed the dog tag beneath her scrubs. She didn't let him hold her gaze. She moved past him the way she moved through everything, present but not present, visible but not notable. She delivered the fresh linens to room 409 with the same care she'd give to a newborn. Straightened the supply cart. Checked the 4 stations. Breathed in the antiseptic smell that was the only thing that ever felt like home. Behind her, she heard Colonel Hartley ask the charge nurse, "Who was that?" The charge nurse didn't look up from her computer. "Which one?" "We have 18 nurses on this unit alone." "The one with the dark hair." "The linens." The charge nurse shrugged. "Megan. She's been here 3 years. Good with the kids. Quiet." "Why?" "Silence. The kind where you could hear the ventilators humming through the walls, the monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the world continuing to move." Then, no reason. But his eyes had changed. Something in them had shifted from the careful, professional demeanor of a consultant to something sharper. He knew. Maybe not consciously. Maybe just in the way that soldiers know danger when it walks past them in a hospital corridor. Maybe just in the way that men who'd stood next to someone in hell recognize them when they see them in light. Megan kept moving. Moving was always the answer. Movement meant continuity. Movement meant nobody asked questions. At 8:14 a.m., the emergency call came through the intercom. The sound cut through the pediatric ICU like a blade. Not code blue. Not yet. Something worse. Something incoming. Trauma alert. 7-year-old male. Farming accident. ETA 8 minutes. Severe crush injuries. Abdominal trauma. Possible internal bleeding. Unresponsive. Colonel James Hartley is the father. Notify pediatric surgery immediately. The intercom clicked off. The unit moved the way it always moved during a trauma-controlled chaos, everyone flowing toward their assigned position without needing instruction. The trauma bay doors opened. Crash carts rolled out. Suction equipment tested. For lines prepared. The charge nurse called Dr. Caldwell's office. His secretary said he was in clinic but would be notified. His response time was typically 7 minutes. Megan stood near the medication station, linen still in her hands, watching the organized panic unfold. She saw the stretcher being prepared. Saw the trauma surgeon, Dr. Caldwell's second, Dr. Patricia Chen, already in the bay, gloves snapping on like gunshots. Saw the ventilator check, the oxygen lines verified, the entire machinery of a level 1 pediatric trauma center sliding into place. She didn't move toward the trauma bay. She never did. Nurses like her, the ones without credentials that held up to scrutiny, the ones whose presence in critical moments would be remembered, stayed in supporting positions. Fetching supplies. Running labs. Existing in the background where nobody looked. Behind her, she heard a sound. The distinct thud of a cane hitting the floor hard enough to crack tile. She didn't turn around, but she heard Colonel Hartley's breathing, sharp, controlled, the breathing of a man whose child was 7 minutes away from an operating room. He's deaf, Colonel Hartley said to no one. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, barely contained. He's been deaf since birth. He reads lips. If he wakes up before anyone explains what's happening. Dr. Patricia Chen didn't break her focus on the crash cart inventory. We'll make sure he has a familiar face when he wakes. No, Colonel Hartley said. No, that's not what I mean. He needs to know his father was here. He needs to see me. If he can't hear me, at least he can see me. The intercom crackled again. Different voice. Urgent. Incoming ambulance, 3 minutes. Patient code Delta Hartley. Stand by all personnel. 3 minutes. That was how long they had to prepare for a child whose father was a Green Beret colonel, who'd survived every firefight in Helmand Province, who was about to watch his son roll through those trauma bay doors on a stretcher. 3 minutes for the doctors to arrange themselves in the precise positions they trained for. 3 minutes for the hospital to decide whether this child would live or die. Megan set the linens on the counter. Her hands didn't tremble. She knew better. She'd been trained by the 160th SAW and a classified task force that no longer existed to keep her hands steady when the rest of the world fell apart. She watched the trauma bay prepare. Watched the personnel assemble. Watched Dr. Caldwell arrive, moving fast, already in surgical thinking mode, mentally preparing his approach. And then the ambulance doors burst open and a child was rolling through the trauma bay entrance. The trauma bay fell silent when Dr. Caldwell entered. 10 physicians stood around Daniel Hartley's small body like pallbearers at a funeral that hadn't officially begun. 2 trauma surgeons. 3 organ specialists. 5 consulting physicians. Each one wearing the same expression, clinical distance, already finished with the work of saving him. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that felt like concrete inside his ribcage. A crush injury from a tractor rollover at 2:48 p.m. Internal bleeding they could see on the CT scan but couldn't locate. Lacerated liver. Ruptured kidney. Intestinal trauma in 3 separate locations. The numbers on the monitors told a story of a body breaking apart from the inside. Colonel James Hartley stood in the corner, his service dress uniform creased with perfect military precision, but his hands trembled as he held the consent forms. A Green Beret colonel who had walked through the worst terrain on Earth, who had ordered men to breach compounds and extract hostages, who had survived shrapnel in his left shoulder and a bullet wound that still ached when the weather changed, now completely powerless. His deaf son couldn't hear the ventilator. Couldn't hear the monitors. In the silence that was Daniel's entire world, machines screamed. Megan stood at the bedside checking the flow rate, her movements precise and economical. Her badge caught the fluorescent overhead light. She'd been in this room for 42 minutes, watching the team examine Daniel with the careful detachment of experts measuring corpses. But she'd also been watching his imaging. The ultrasound films. The CT scan spread across the light box like a roadmap of internal destruction. And there, in the posterior abdomen, behind the main bleed, everyone was looking at something smaller. Something they'd catalogued and dismissed because it wasn't the loudest problem in the room. Dr. Caldwell consulted his tablet, then looked at Colonel Hartley with the expression of a man delivering a verdict he'd already made peace with. Regret performed for an audience. The injuries are beyond what we can surgically manage, he said, each word falling like a stone into still water. Multiple organ failure is inevitable. We can keep him comfortable. We can manage his pain. But surgery would only extend his suffering without changing the outcome. The words hung in the antiseptic air. Comfort care. The medical euphemism for letting a child die. Colonel Hartley's jaw clenched. His eyes found Daniel's face, then looked away as if the sight of his son was a wound he couldn't stop pressing. How long? His voice came out like a transmission grinding through gears. Hours. Days. It depends on his physiology. Megan stepped forward. The move was small, 2 steps toward Dr. Caldwell, but something in the room shifted. All 10 physicians turned. There's a vascular approach you haven't considered, she said, her voice steady and low. Access through the posterior retroperitoneum. We can reach the iliac vessels without disturbing the primary injury sites. If we control that secondary bleed first. Nurse O'Brien. Dr. Caldwell's voice carried the weight of a boot coming down on glass. Every resident in the room heard the moment he decided to make an example of her. He set his tablet down on Daniel's bedside table with deliberate care. Let me clarify something for the family's benefit. 10 board-certified physicians, including 2 trauma surgeons from Duke Medical Center, have just completed a comprehensive assessment of your son's injuries. We have reviewed every imaging study. We have examined every system. And we have reached a unanimous conclusion. He turned to face Colonel Hartley directly, angling his body so that Megan stood at the edge of his peripheral vision. A subtle exclusion. A stage direction. Perhaps you'd like to share your medical degree with us. Dr. Caldwell continued, his tone carrying the texture of a man explaining basic arithmetic to a child. Or would you prefer to let the physicians handle the medical decisions while you focus on what you do understand? The resident shifted. One, a third-year surgical resident named Morrison, allowed himself the smallest smile. Megan felt it register in her field of vision. The pecking order being established. The hierarchy reinforced. The nurse who speaks out of turn is a problem that needs solving. This decorated officer, Dr. Caldwell said, raising his voice slightly so every person in the room could hear clearly, doesn't need false hope from someone who empties bedpans. Know your place, Nurse O'Brien. This decision has been made. Megan's hands remained steady. Her breathing never changed. The muscle that tightened in her jaw was the only visible reaction, and it lasted perhaps half a second before she controlled it. What was happening in her chest, the pressure, the heat, the weight of 13 years of silence, belonged to her alone. Not to this room. Not to these people. Colonel Hartley's eyes met hers for just a moment. Something flickered there. Recognition that burned like a fuse being lit. But then he looked away, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. Bound by the same secrecy that had buried her. Ordered to let her disappear after Marja. Told that if she resurfaced, if she spoke her name or her service, everyone from that operation would be compromised. Blown. Burned down like a compound in Helmand Province. The 10 doctors filed out, their conclusion final. The consent form sat on the bedside table waiting for Colonel Hartley's signature. He stared at them like they were written in a language he'd never learned. The break room smelled like lukewarm coffee and the particular staleness of a space where people took breaks they didn't want. Megan sat at the small round table with her lunch, a container of yogurt she wasn't going to eat. She'd learned long ago that it was easier to look busy than to sit in actual stillness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like insects trapped in the tubes. 4 nurses came in, Sarah, Jennifer, Marcus, and Tom. They saw her. Made eye contact. Then, in a movement that was choreographed and silent, all 4 rose from the table where they'd been standing and moved to the far corner of the break room. The message was precise and understood by everyone involved: don't sit with the woman who challenged the senior physician. Association is contagion. Attention seeker, one of them muttered. Marcus. Low enough that it could be denied, loud enough that Megan could hear every syllable clearly. Thinks she's smarter than the entire attending team. Probably got rejected from med school. Megan took one measured breath. Set her fork down. Continued eating her yogurt with the mechanical precision of someone performing an act of ordinary living while standing on the edge of a cliff. The yogurt tasted like nothing. She chewed anyway. Dr. Caldwell entered the break room at 1:14 p.m., pulling a coffee mug from the cabinet. He didn't look at Megan directly. He didn't need to. He could feel her attention the way a predator feels the gaze of prey. He poured his coffee slowly, the brown liquid steaming and fragrant, actual coffee from the good machine, not the tank that everyone else used. When he turned, his smirk was the kind that carries weight. Satisfied. The expression of a man who'd just won a confrontation and was now collecting his victory lap. Megan looked up from her yogurt and met his eyes. One tear escaped down her left cheek. Just one. Not trembling. Not a breakdown. A single tear that she didn't try to hide, moving with deliberate slowness to wipe it away with the back of her hand while maintaining absolute eye contact. The gesture was controlled and contained, but it communicated something that words couldn't reach: I'm present. I'm not broken. I'm still here. I've watched better men than you condemn children to death because they were too afraid to try, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It carried the same steady register as someone ordering medication dosages or reading off vital signs. Factual. Observable. Beyond argument. Dr. Caldwell's smirk collapsed. His hand tightened on his coffee mug. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, something like fear moved across his face. Then he turned and left the break room without speaking. Megan finished her yogurt alone. The formal write-up appeared on the unit bulletin board at 3:27 p.m., printed on official hospital letterhead and laminated for durability. A document designed to be seen. Designed to stay visible. Nurse M. The Bryan, overstepping scope of practice. Undermining physician authority. Providing false hope to patient families. Behavior grounds for further review. Every staff member who walked past could read it. Every doctor. Every resident. Every student. The permanent record of a nurse who had spoken and been corrected for it. A third-year surgical resident named Morrison took a photograph with his phone, chuckling to his colleague, "Did you see what she tried to pull? 10 board-certified physicians and she thinks she knows better." Megan saw the write-up when she returned to the unit at 4:22 p.m. She read it once, registered the language, noted the formatting and date. Then she turned and walked to the medication room without any change in her facial expression. The weight of it, the public humiliation, the documentation of her overreach, the message to every staff member that challenging Dr. Caldwell carried consequences, she packed it down into the same compartment where she kept the memory of Marja. Where she kept the faces of the soldiers she couldn't save. In the hallway outside Daniel's room, Colonel Hartley stood alone in his dress uniform. His left shoulder bore a service ribbon from a classified operation that would never be declassified. His chest carried decorations that represented operations no one would ever name. He stared through the window into his son's room, where Daniel lay unconscious beneath the green glow of the ventilator display, and his hand moved to his own chest. To the spot where a dog tag had hung for 14 years until he'd been ordered to remove it. Until Major Megan O'Brien was officially erased from every military database and told to disappear into civilian life with fabricated credentials and a silence that would last forever. His eyes found hers as she passed the room. For just a moment, barely longer than a heartbeat, they made contact. Acknowledgement. The terrible weight of recognition between two people who couldn't acknowledge knowing each other. Then Colonel Hartley looked back at his son and his jaw clenched so hard she could see it from 12 feet away. His hand dropped from his chest. She kept walking. The next morning, the ICU schedule had changed. Sarah and Jennifer, the two nurses who had been sympathetic, who had said they believed Megan might have seen something, were suddenly reassigned to different floors effective immediately. Pediatrics on the 3rd floor for Sarah. Cardiac care on 6 for Jennifer. The decision had come from Dr. Caldwell during the morning staff meeting, delivered with administrative efficiency. "We need to distribute our experienced personnel more equitably across all departments." Everyone knew what it meant. Megan was assigned a senior nurse shadow during every shift. A woman named Patricia who didn't make eye contact and carried a clipboard as if it were a weapon. The message was clear: Nurse O'Brien would not be left alone with Daniel Hartley. She would not have opportunity to continue pushing, to advocate, to think. That afternoon, Megan sat in the break room during her mandatory lunch break and reviewed Daniel's imaging on her personal phone, something she shouldn't do, records she shouldn't access on an unsecured device. But the discrepancy was eating at her. The CT showed a secondary bleed in the posterior abdomen, but the measurements didn't align with the clinical picture. The blood loss rate on the lab work didn't match a tear of that size. Something else was bleeding. Something smaller, something overlooked because everyone's attention was locked on the main injury. She printed the images at a public library after her shift and brought them back to work in her jacket pocket. Not official. Not documented. Just a nurse with a hunch that meant nothing because she'd already been proven wrong by 10 board-certified physicians. Dr. Caldwell's office door was open when she approached the next morning. She knocked once and entered. The imaging discrepancies on the Hartley case. "Your job is medications and vitals, not radiology interpretation." He didn't look up from his computer screen. "The assessment is complete, nurse. Let it go." That night, sitting in her 2001 Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot, Megan pulled up news archives on her phone. Major operation, classified operation, 0 records. No mention of the 42 soldiers she and Colonel Hartley had pulled out of a compound that was coming down in controlled explosions. No record of the field thoracotomy she'd performed with a combat knife because her actual surgical instruments had been in the vehicle that got hit. No documentation of the call sign they'd given her afterward, Angel. Because she'd kept saving people even when the order came to pull out. Going public meant burning that operation. Burning every soldier who'd been there. Burning Colonel Hartley's family. Staying silent meant watching his son die. Dr. Caldwell sat in his office at 6:43 a.m. the following morning and called the charge nurse into his space. His voice was low and careful, the tone of someone managing a liability. If Nurse O'Brien goes near the Hartley room alone, I want to know immediately. Understood? She's a liability. A safety concern. I need documentation of anything that looks like unauthorized access or advocacy that exceeds her scope. The charge nurse nodded. She'd worked with Dr. Caldwell for 7 years. She knew which way the wind blew. The next morning, Dr. Caldwell arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with a plan that required no raised voice, no visible anger, only the quiet competence of a man who understood institutional power. He moved through the ICU like a chess master positioning pieces, each action deliberate, each consequence cascading into the next. By 6:44 a.m., before the day shift arrived, he had already neutralized the threat that was Megan O'Brien. Sarah Chen and Jennifer Martinez, the 2 nurses who had stood beside Megan in the break room, found their assignments changed when they clocked in. A simple notation on the master schedule, Sarah reassigned to the cardiac recovery unit on the 3rd floor, Jennifer moved to orthopedics in the East Wing. No explanation. No negotiation. When Sarah approached the charge nurse, she was told the reassignments came directly from Dr. Caldwell due to staffing optimization. Both women knew better. Helping Megan had cost them proximity to the ICU where they could watch Daniel Hartley's care. They were gone before 7:13 a.m. The isolation was complete. But Dr. Caldwell wasn't finished. At 7:15 a.m., he accessed the master schedule in the ICU planning office and made a series of adjustments that looked, on paper, like reasonable coverage decisions. Megan's shifts were now paired exclusively with supervising nurses who reported directly to him, nurses who understood their position depended on Dr. Caldwell's goodwill. More importantly, he removed her from any 4-hour block where she might have unsupervised access to Daniel's room. She would have eyes on her at all times. She would have no opportunity to examine the child's imaging without witnesses. She would have no chance to question his treatment decisions behind closed doors. The schedule change was institutional brilliance disguised as logistics. At 8:13 a.m., while Megan was in Daniel's room checking vitals, Dr. Caldwell sat in his office on the 4th floor with his phone pressed to his ear. The first call went to Gerald Thorne, a hospital board member and friend of 30 years. "Gerald, I need to talk to you about a personnel concern before it becomes a patient safety issue," Dr. Caldwell began, his voice carrying the gravity of a man bearing difficult truths. "One of our pediatric nurses, bright girl, but dangerously idealistic, is showing signs of what I can only describe as reckless judgment. She's pushing families toward experimental treatments despite clear medical consensus. The Hartley family is vulnerable, grieving, and she's giving them false hope based on her own overconfidence." He paused, letting Gerald absorb this. "I'm documenting everything, of course. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. Maverick tendencies like this, they start with one nurse convinced she knows better than 10 physicians. They end in lawsuits and dead children." The second call went to Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the chief of medicine. Same message, different language. "Patricia, I wanted to give you a heads up about a developing situation in pediatrics. One of our nursing staff is demonstrating what I'd characterize as dangerous independent judgment. She's contradicting physician directives, questioning treatment plans, pressuring families. It's the kind of thing that can spread if we don't address it early. I'm managing it, but I wanted you aware in case she escalates or takes this to administration." The third call was to Marcus Weinstein, the hospital's risk management officer. Marcus, I'm documenting a potential scope of practice violation by a pediatric ICU nurse. She's asserting medical opinions beyond her credentials and pressuring a family with a dying child. I've already formally warned her once. I'm protecting the hospital by keeping detailed records, but I wanted you to know this is in progress. If she continues, we may need to escalate to HR. By 9:15 a.m., Dr. Caldwell had successfully woven a narrative across the institution's nervous system. Megan O'Brien was no longer a concerned nurse. She was a liability. A maverick. A threat to patient safety and institutional integrity. 3 board members and 2 senior administrators now had his version of events lodged in their minds like shrapnel. Colonel Hartley heard none of this, but he felt its effects the moment he arrived at the ICU at 10:13 a.m. The supervising nurse who had been warm yesterday was now professionally distant. When he asked about Daniel's condition, she referred him to Dr. Caldwell. When he lingered near the nursing station where Megan was charting, the charge nurse shifted her position to block his line of sight. The walls had closed in, and the mechanism was too subtle to protest. Megan worked through the morning with the awareness of a hunted animal. She could feel the observation without seeing it. She could sense the shift in the room's weight when she entered. By noon, she understood, she had been cut off from allies, separated from Daniel's direct care during vulnerable hours, and preemptively discredited to everyone who mattered. It was a masterclass in institutional sabotage, conducted with such clinical precision that she could almost admire it if it weren't designed to bury her. But by 2:11 p.m. on that third day, everything shifted. Daniel's oxygen saturation began trending downward. The numbers that had stabilized yesterday now dropped with the slow, inexorable momentum of a plane losing altitude. 94%. 91%. 87%. The trend was so gradual that it might have looked like equipment drift to a less experienced eye, but Megan had watched enough patients die to recognize the language their vital signs spoke. This was no fluctuation. This was deterioration. Dr. Caldwell's response was textbook crisis management, textbook wrong management. When Daniel's blood pressure began to soften and his oxygen needs increased, Dr. Caldwell increased the sedation and ordered vasopressors, medications that would push more blood around his body without fixing whatever was broken underneath. He was treating the dashboard warning lights instead of looking under the hood. It was the approach of a man treating a symptom set rather than a diagnosis. Megan stood at the monitor bank in the hallway at 2:41 p.m., ostensibly reviewing charting on another patient, her eyes locked on Daniel's rhythm. Her trained eye caught what the EKG had missed, what the chest X-ray had misinterpreted due to rib positioning obscuring the view. The pattern was unmistakable, the mediastinal shift, the oxygen desaturation despite supplemental support, the tachycardia that wouldn't respond to sedation. Tension pneumothorax. A pocket of air in the pleural space, building pressure, collapsing his lung, compressing his heart. It was a correctable condition. It was a condition a 7-year-old boy should not die from when the fix took 6 minutes and a needle. She approached Dr. Caldwell in the medication room at 3:15 p.m., her voice level, her posture deferential. "Doctor, I want to confirm something on the imaging." The rib positioning on his anterior-posterior film, it obscured the mediastinal space. "Did you review the lateral view?" Her hands were steady. Her voice carried no accusation, only the careful language of a nurse seeking clarification from her physician. Dr. Caldwell's jaw tightened. His eyes went flat. "The imaging is my responsibility, Nurse O'Brien. The diagnosis is my responsibility. The treatment is my responsibility." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a register that made the fluorescent light seem to buzz louder. "You are already on thin ice. Dangerously thin. I suggest you focus on following orders rather than questioning my clinical judgment. One more challenge from you, and I'll have you removed from this unit within the hour. Am I clear?" She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She let the silence hold for 3 seconds, long enough that his breathing became audible, long enough that his certainty cracked slightly in the space where her composure should have fragmented. Then she turned and walked back to the ICU floor. Behind her, Dr. Caldwell stood in the medication room, his hands trembling with a rage that came from being disrespected by someone who should have been terrified. Colonel Hartley was standing near the window overlooking the parking lot when he overheard this exchange through the half-open medication room door. He heard Dr. Caldwell's ultimatum. He heard Megan's footsteps leave without a response. He understood, in that moment, that the woman who wore his dead friend's dog tag had just been silenced by protocol and hierarchy at the exact moment a child needed her most. The night shift began at 10:19 p.m. The ICU staffing pattern that evening was one of Dr. Caldwell's most subtle manipulations. The charge nurse was Diane Morris, competent but new to critical cases, and she was scheduled for a mandatory incident report meeting on the 4th floor at 2:16 a.m., a meeting that would last 45 minutes, leaving the ICU unsupervised for that window. The overnight physician was Dr. Rebecca Santos, a good surgeon but not assigned to pediatrics, currently covering the ER downstairs with explicit instructions from Dr. Caldwell not to come up to the ICU unless called for a code. The nearest trauma surgeon was Dr. Mitchell Graves, located at Duke Medical Center 30 minutes away. All of this was documented in the system as normal scheduling. None of it was accidental. Megan completed her 11:51 p.m. vital signs on Daniel Hartley. Oxygen saturation 82%. Heart rate 118. Blood pressure 94/52, elevated vasopressor doses barely maintaining perfusion. The child's body was failing in slow motion, and the system designed to catch him was locked down by protocol and Dr. Caldwell's strategic genius. She sat at the nurse's station and pulled Daniel's imaging onto her terminal. The lateral chest X-ray, the one that might have shown the pneumothorax clearly if anyone had bothered to review it. Her fingers traced the scan across the screen. There. The mediastinal shift was subtle but present. The collapsed right lung. The pressure building in a space meant to hold only breath and nothing else. The diagnosis was there. It had always been there. 10 doctors had missed it because they were looking at the anterior-posterior view where rib shadows obscure the truth. It was a common miss. It was also a fatal one. She documented her observation in Daniel's digital record, recommend review of lateral imaging for possible tension pneumothorax given current clinical trajectory and vital sign deterioration. It was an order waiting to be ignored. It was a warning no one would acknowledge. At 1:16 a.m., the charge nurse Diane Morris left for her meeting on the 4th floor. At 1:52 a.m., a new admission came through the ER, a teenage motor vehicle accident that demanded Dr. Santos's immediate attention. At 1:54 a.m., Megan was alone at the ICU nurse's station with 4 critical patients and the full weight of a night shift pressing down on the quiet hours. The monitors began their escalation at 1:59 a.m. Daniel's oxygen saturation dropped to 76%. Then 71%. The ventilator alarm triggered, high pressure in the airway, something blocking airflow. His heart rate climbed to 142, then 158. The tracheal deviation became visible even to the naked eye, his small neck twisted by pressure inside his chest cavity. The distended neck veins bloomed like dark channels across his throat. Classic tension pneumothorax. The condition that kills children in minutes once it becomes symptomatic. Megan moved. Her hands knew what to do before her conscious mind finished registering the decision. She ran to Daniel's room. The code button went down, a signal that would bring nurses and doctors running from all corners of the hospital. But they would take 4 minutes to arrive. Daniel had maybe 2. The crash cart sat against the wall, stocked and ready. Her hands moved like they were being piloted by someone else, someone whose body remembered what her official credentials said she had never done. She tore open the sterile field. The needle, a 14-gauge angiocath, oversized for pediatric work but necessary for rapid decompression. Her left hand found the space between his ribs at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The landmark where pressure had been building, where the needle needed to go. Her right hand moved the needle forward with the confidence of someone who had done this dozens of times, though the official record said never, not once, not in any hospital approved by any licensing board in any state. The hiss. That familiar sound, air escaping at velocity, the pressure inside Daniel's chest suddenly finding a route to the outside world. His oxygen saturation began climbing immediately. 78%. 82%. 87%. His heart rate dropped from 158 to 128. The distension in his neck veins began to flatten. Color returned to his lips. The footsteps came seconds later. Running boots on tile, multiple sets, the sound of the ICU mobilizing. Dr. Santos burst through the door at 2:03 a.m. and stopped cold, taking in the scene, a child with a needle between his ribs, a nurse with her hand steady on the catheter, vital signs climbing, and no physician anywhere near the code that had been running in her hands for 4 minutes. The oxygen saturation refused to climb. 58%. 59. The monitor screamed its mechanical warning into the 2 a.m. silence of the pediatric ICU, and Megan O'Brien stood alone in Daniel Hartley's room with a child whose lungs had stopped answering. Chest wall retracting like a fish gasping on concrete. The ventilator pushing air that went nowhere. His blood pressure had already dropped to 72/38, the kind of numbers that meant minutes, not hours. She'd seen this before. Marja, 2010. A Marine lieutenant with a sucking chest wound and an oxygen sat that wouldn't budge. She'd recognized the pattern then, too, breath sound silent on the right, trachea shifting left, jugular veins distending. The physical exam screaming what the imaging had missed. Tension pneumothorax. A pocket of air pressing against the heart, suffocating the child from the inside out. The staffing gap had created an impossible window. 3 nurses had called in sick, coincidence or Dr. Caldwell's timing, she didn't know anymore. The trauma surgeon was 30 minutes out, tied up in another emergency across the hospital. The attending intensivist had stepped away for a phone call. Which meant that at 2:07 a.m., in a room on the 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial, a child was dying, and the only person in the world who could save him was someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Megan's hands moved before her mind caught up. Not a decision. A reflex. Muscle memory from 1,000 hours in blast tents and field operating rooms, from a lifetime of choosing between protocol and breathing. She gathered supplies in silence. The cart with the emergency intubation equipment doubled as a trauma kit. Scalpel. The blade caught the fluorescent light, cold steel that weighed nothing and meant everything. Her fingers found it the way they found everything in her old life, through instinct, through training encoded so deep it lived in her nervous system. She didn't announce what she was doing. Didn't call for backup or wait for authorization. Those were luxuries for people who had the time to talk. Daniel's oxygen sat had dropped to 42%. His heart rate was climbing toward dangerous territory, 160, then 170. The child's body was screaming for oxygen in a voice only machines could hear. Easy, she whispered to him, though he couldn't hear, had never heard a human voice in his 7 years. She compressed his ribs gently, marking the space between the 4th and 5th ribs, the mid-axillary line where a chest tube belonged. The child's skin was pale as paper, almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights. The scalpel was steady as surgical steel could be. 1 incision. 6 inches. Deep enough to reach the pleural space, shallow enough to avoid the lung itself. The blade parted skin and muscle with the kind of precision that came from having done it before in darker places, with worse odds and louder guns. Air hissed out like a held breath finally released. The boy's chest immediately relaxed. His oxygen saturation climbed, 45%, 52%, 61%. She could hear it in his blood pressure too, the systolic rising from 72 to 84, the vessel sounds returning to something that resembled normal. Megan fashioned the chest tube from what the ICU had provided. A suction catheter from the bedside, connectors from the 4 supplies, tubing designed for fluids now carrying air. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of Marja, no hesitation, no second guessing. This was a field surgical unit in a hospital with better lighting and climate control, nothing more. She inserted the tube with the precision of someone who'd performed this exact procedure while artillery hammered the compound walls around her. The catheter slid between the ribs with minimal resistance. She felt the give of the pleura, then the rush of pressurized air escaping as the pneumothorax decompressed. Daniel's color returned instantly, the gray-blue fading to something closer to living skin. His oxygen saturation climbed past 70%, past 80%, stabilizing at 93% where it belonged. The monitors began singing a different song. Still urgent, still elevated, but singing instead of screaming. Heart rate dropping toward 130. Blood pressure rising to 96/52. The numbers of a child being saved instead of dying. She was still securing the tube with sutures, her hand steady as a surgical laser, fingers remembering which knots didn't slip under pressure, when Dr. Caldwell arrived with the surgical team behind him. He stopped in the doorway. Stared. The chart in his hand seemed to weigh more suddenly, as if the weight of what he was seeing had transferred into the paper. For 5 seconds nobody breathed. The machines filled the silence with their beeping, their hissing, their confirmation of life returning. "What have you done?" Caldwell's voice came out like something fractured. Not a question. An accusation. Megan continued her suturing. 1 knot. 2 knots. The kind of knots that held through combat and chaos, and the kind of saves that weren't supposed to happen. Tension pneumothorax on the right. 10 doctors missed it on imaging. The boy's been dying from air in his pleural space for 17 hours. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. I performed an emergency decompression that saved his life. The pneumothorax was undiagnosed. The pressure was collapsing his right lung. Caldwell's face was draining of color, but his voice stayed steady. Cold. Professional in the way that terrible men could be professional. You violated every protocol. Every scope of practice. You're a nurse, not a surgeon. I'm looking at a child with an oxygen saturation of 93% who was at 42% 8 minutes ago. The surgical team stood frozen, uncertain whether to approach the bed or watch whatever this was unfold. The room felt like it was holding its breath. You're suspended effective immediately. Caldwell's hand was already moving toward the call button. Security. I'm calling security. Megan tied off the last knot and stepped back from Daniel's bedside. The child's chest was rising and falling in the rhythm of breathing that meant survival. His color had shifted from the deadfish pale to something like healthy. His monitors sang the song of stable vital signs. She'd done what she came to do. She'd saved the boy. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt the weight of 17 years catching up, the weight of disappearing from her own life, of walking away from a commission and a career and everyone she'd served with. The weight of the broken dog tag chain under her scrubs, the only proof that the life she'd lived in Marja had been real. Colonel Hartley appeared in the doorway as 2 security guards approached. He took in the scene, his son breathing, the monitors displaying the vital signs of survival, the nurse with blood on her glove standing at the foot of the bed. For just a moment his hand opened, his mouth opened, and she saw something cross his face that looked like recognition and grief and the terrible weight of secrets that couldn't be broken. Then his jaw clenched. The moment passed. Whatever he might have said would have exposed them both to questions neither could answer. The truth lived in the space between duty and silence, and they both knew which one had to win. I'm fine, Megan said quietly to the security guards. She didn't resist when they guided her away from the bed. Didn't look at Daniel as she left. Couldn't. If she looked at the child's face, saw the life in his eyes that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier, the composure she'd been holding onto would crack into 1,000 pieces. She handed her badge to the guard on the left. It was a temporary credential anyway, a fabrication designed to disappear, just like she'd been designed to disappear. Just another thing that wasn't real. Dr. Caldwell's voice followed her down the corridor. This is what happens when people forget their place. When they think credentials mean knowledge. She could have killed him. The fact that she didn't doesn't make what she did acceptable. It makes it worse. The night shift nurses kept their eyes on their charts as Megan walked past. The break room was dark. The unit board still displayed the write-up Caldwell had posted, a formal notation of her overstepping her scope of practice, her dangerous maverick tendencies, her inability to follow protocol. All true. All incomplete. All the documentation of a life that had never existed in the first place. The hospital laundry room was warm and smelled of industrial detergent and steam. She folded her scrubs one final time, the fabric still warm from the morning wash. Blue cotton that had touched 1,000 lives, none of them knowing who the hands inside that fabric actually were. None of them understanding that the quiet nurse in the corner had performed battlefield amputations. Had saved 47 lives under direct enemy fire. Had earned a call sign, Angel, that meant she kept people alive when everyone else had given up. The fabric was clean now. No blood. No evidence of what she'd done at 2:07 a.m. She folded it into thirds, then into quarters, each crease precise. The broken dog tag chain caught the fluorescent light as she moved. A small constellation of scars and service, visible only to her. The military serial number was still legible on one tag, proof of a rank she couldn't claim, a unit she couldn't name, a life she wasn't supposed to be living. She set the folded scrubs on the counter and walked out. The parking lot was empty. The rain had stopped sometime during the crisis, leaving everything slick and reflecting the sodium lights. Behind her, on the third floor, Daniel Hartley's oxygen saturation held steady at 93%. His heart rate was down to 120. His father was sitting beside his bed, reading lips that weren't moving, waiting for his son to open his eyes and see that he was alive. Megan didn't know yet that in 3 days, when Daniel woke from the medically induced coma, he would sign a single word to his father while the television played in the corner. Didn't know that he would see her photograph on the news and recognize the woman who had saved him with the hands of someone who'd been saving people her entire life. Didn't know that the Pentagon was about to call into a broadcast and crack open 17 years of secrets like an egg. But Dr. Caldwell knew. Or would know soon enough. He was about to learn that she wasn't just a nurse who'd overstepped her authority. He was about to learn that he'd picked a fight with someone who'd been carrying invisible medals his entire career, someone whose security clearance was older than his medical degree. The walk to her car was the longest walk Megan had ever taken, and that included 3 tours in Kandahar. 3 days later, Dr. Caldwell sat across from the WRAL news anchor in the studio's warm glow, his posture perfect, his confidence restored. He'd prepared for this moment, the chance to control the narrative before it spiraled. The anchor, a woman named Patricia Chen with sharp eyes, leaned forward slightly. Behind them both, the morning light filtered through studio windows overlooking downtown Raleigh, the city still asleep at 6 in the morning. "Doctor, can you walk us through your decision to recommend comfort care for Daniel Hartley?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of broadcast journalism. Caldwell smiled, the kind of smile that had worked 1,000 times before, calibrated to suggest wisdom and compassion in equal measure. When a child presents with internal injuries of that severity, our ethical obligation is to prevent suffering. The surgical team examined every imaging modality. The consensus was unanimous. 10 physicians. All board-certified trauma specialists. We were protecting the child from prolonged pain. He paused, letting that settle. What I couldn't have anticipated was a nurse with no surgical credentials deciding to perform unauthorized procedures in the middle of the night. That puts families in impossible positions. It gives false hope. Patricia nodded, making a note. The interview would air at 9. By noon, it would be clipped and shared. Caldwell had already calculated the messaging strategy with the hospital's PR team. Control the story. Discredit the rogue nurse. Re-establish authority. He never saw what was coming. At that exact moment, in a pediatric ICU room 3 miles away, Daniel Hartley's eyes opened. Colonel James Hartley sat in the chair beside his son's bed, his scarred hands folded on his lap, his green beret insignia pinned carefully to his jacket despite the civilian clothes. For 72 hours, he had barely left that chair. For 72 hours, Daniel had existed in the space between sleep and something darker, his small body suspended in the chemical silence of induced sedation. The ventilator had breathed for him. Machines had done the work of living while his father prayed to a God he'd stopped believing in during his third tour in Kandahar. Now the machines were quieter. The rhythms had changed. The ICU team had tapered the sedation. Megan had been clear, he'll wake up soon. When he does, let him know he's safe. She'd said it looking directly at Colonel Hartley, her voice carrying that strange timbre he recognized from Marja, the voice of someone who'd held life in her hands and knew exactly what pressure to apply. Daniel's eyes moved beneath closed lids. His fingers twitched. Then his eyes opened, unfocused at first, finding the ceiling panels with their grid of fluorescent lights. Colonel Hartley stood. His breath came in a way he hadn't allowed himself to breathe in days. "Hey, buddy," he signed with careful hands, the ASL flowing from muscle memory and 17 years of raising a deaf son. "You're okay. You're safe. You're in the hospital." Daniel's eyes tracked to his father's hands. He blinked, slowly, the way people do when they're surfacing from deep water. His lips moved. No sound came, there never would be, but his father read the shape. "Dad. Right here, son. Right here." The monitors responded, heart rate climbing to normal wakefulness, oxygen saturation holding steady at 98%. Stable. Alive. The small chest rose and fell with the rhythm of his own breathing, the ventilator already weaning. Daniel's head turned slowly on the pillow, taking in the room, processing the tubes running from his arms, the leads on his chest, the evidence of survival. Then his eyes drifted toward the television mounted in the corner of the room. The morning news was on, sound low. Patricia Chen's face filled the screen. Behind her, standing in a hospital corridor with his arms crossed, was Dr. Caldwell. Daniel's eyes locked onto the footage. His hands moved. In ASL, the sign for angel begins at the shoulders, hands crossing like wings. Daniel made it with one small hand, his fingers weak but deliberate, his eyes never leaving the screen. But it wasn't a general angel he was signing. It was the call sign. The one from Marja. The one that only 3 people in the world understood. Colonel Hartley's head snapped toward the television. On screen, Dr. Caldwell was saying, "What I couldn't have anticipated was a nurse with no surgical credentials." And below the anchor, a Chiron was running, pediatric ICU nurse fired for unauthorized procedures. And in that moment, Colonel Hartley saw the photograph. The one they'd pulled from Oak Creek Memorial's staff directory. It was Megan, her hair pulled back, her expression neutral, wearing a hospital ID badge. She looked nothing like the major he'd known in Kandahar. She looked exactly like the major he'd known in Kandahar. His son was signing her call sign. Colonel Hartley's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Not shaking with fear. Shaking with the recognition of exactly what he was about to unleash. The Pentagon liaison's name was Captain Sarah Morrison, and her voice carried the precision of someone authorized to speak for the Department of Defense on live television. She called into WIL's morning broadcast exactly 43 minutes after Daniel Hartley woke up, exactly 7 minutes after Patricia Chen finished the segment with Dr. Caldwell. "Patricia, thank you for the opportunity to provide context," Morrison began, her tone suggesting this was merely a clarification, nothing more dramatic than a footnote. "The woman in your report, identified as a pediatric ICU nurse, is actually Major Megan O'Brien, recipient of 2 Silver Stars and the Distinguished Service Medal for actions conducted in classified military operations." The studio fell silent. The kind of silence that happens when a broadcast's carefully planned trajectory suddenly changes direction mid-flight. "I'm sorry, a major." Patricia's professionalism cracked, just slightly. Major Megan O'Brien served 12 years in the United States Army Medical Corps with the 75th Ranger Regiment and various Joint Special Operations Command task forces. Her medical innovations in emergency field trauma are currently taught at Fort Bragg's Combat Trauma course. What she performed last night in that pediatric ICU was not outside her scope of practice. It was, in fact, exactly within her scope of practice. Morrison paused. The pause was intentional. The pause was a weapon. The young man she saved was in cardiac arrest. His father is Colonel James Hartley, 10th Special Forces Group. Major O'Brien served under Colonel Hartley's command. She has saved his life and the lives of his unit on 3 separate occasions in Marja. If Major O'Brien had not performed that procedure, Daniel Hartley would be dead as of this morning. Instead, the boy woke up 30 minutes ago. He asked for his father. Patricia's hands moved to her papers, though she wasn't reading. Are you saying this was a classified operation? That she couldn't. Major O'Brien was legally barred from disclosing her background due to federal witness protection protocols related to classified military operations. When she accepted employment at Oak Creek Memorial, she did so under civilian identity. She did not violate protocol. She saved a child's life at great personal cost. The broadcast was already going viral. Screenshots of the exchange were posted within seconds. #Angel of Marja was trending nationally within minutes. The call sign, somehow, had survived 17 years of supposed erasure. The hashtag connected to photographs of Major O'Brien in combat gear, medals on her chest, standing beside Colonel Hartley in the Afghan sun, faces young and unbroken. News outlets were pulling footage of the original pediatric ICU segment, Dr. Caldwell's confident dismissal of unqualified staff who endanger patients, now playing on infinite loop next to images of a decorated military surgeon who'd been forced to disappear. Oak Creek Memorial switchboard was overwhelmed within the hour. Calls from veterans organizations, military families, medical licensing boards. The hospital administrator, a woman named Eleanor Voss, sat in her office with both hands pressed against her forehead, reading legal counsel's briefing with the expression of someone watching their career implode in real time. Federal witness protection laws, the counsel's email read. Wrongful termination exposure. Potential civil rights violation. Public relations catastrophe. We need the board meeting in 30 minutes. Dr. Caldwell attempted to defend his position in that meeting. He sat at the long table in the boardroom, surrounded by faces that had supported him yesterday and abandoned him today. I had no way of knowing her background, he said, his voice steady but his jaw working with tension. She violated protocol. She performed unauthorized procedures. My decisions were based on medical judgment, not. Eleanor Voss cut him off, her hands trembling as she read from legal counsel's briefing. Your phone calls to board members on the evening she raised the surgical option. You stated she was a dangerous maverick. You arranged her reassignment to eliminate her access to the patient. You placed her in a position where Voss's voice cracked. She stopped, regrouped. You systematically isolated a physician with more combat surgery experience than everyone in this room combined. And you did it because she questioned your authority. I documented everything through hospital protocol. 3 board members have now stated those phone calls never happened. Emails are missing. Your text messages to Dr. Reynolds describe this as a chance to eliminate the weak link. Dr. Caldwell, those are the exact words federal investigators will be examining within the hour. The staff break room was quiet. Nurses watched news coverage on their phones, the same nurses who'd walked away from Megan's table just days before now seeing her medical credentials, her decorations, her photograph standing at the edge of a helicopter rotor wash in full combat kit. Sarah and Jennifer, the nurses Caldwell had reassigned to different floors, were being interviewed by local news, their voices carrying the careful articulation of people who'd been waiting for permission to tell the truth. We knew she was different, Sarah said to the camera. The way she moved. The way she assessed situations. Like she was running calculations 3 steps ahead. Dr. Caldwell silenced anyone who supported her. He said she was dangerous. But I watched her save a child's life. I watched her hands move with precision I've never seen before. We should have spoken up. We should have protected her. Colonel Hartley released a statement from Daniel's hospital room, his voice steady and controlled when read aloud on every news outlet in the state. Major Megan O'Brien saved my life and the lives of my entire unit under conditions most people cannot imagine. She saved my son when 10 doctors said it was impossible. She is the finest combat surgeon I have ever known. The fact that she was forced into hiding by the military bureaucracy that created her is a disgrace to the uniform. The fact that she was fired for saving a child's life is an even greater disgrace. The hospital's legal team delivered the ultimatum to Dr. Caldwell on paper, his name typed in formal font, the letterhead official and cold: resign immediately or face termination and investigation. He refused. His voice rose to desperation in the administrator's office, threats of lawsuits, claims that this was persecution, that the military was using its influence to destroy him, that he was the victim here, that he'd made the right call, and no one understood the pressures of his position, no one understood that sometimes the hard choices were the right choices, no one understood. Eleanor Voss stood and walked toward the door. She didn't respond to a word he'd said. By evening, hospital security arrived at his office with cardboard boxes. His personal effects came down from the walls, the framed medical degree, the commendations, the photographs of him receiving awards that suddenly seemed hollow, the markers of an authority that had evaporated between breakfast and dinner. He packed them himself, his hands moving with mechanical precision, the way a soldier packs when told they're being reassigned. A colleague passed in the hallway and looked away. Another one didn't make eye contact either. By the time he left the building, he'd become a ghost haunting the place that had made him. What he didn't see coming was what came after. 6 months later, autumn had turned the hospital's exterior gardens into a canvas of gold and crimson. The maples shed leaves like copper coins across the walkways. Oak Creek Memorial's pediatric ICU had become a different place, renovated, reorganized, renamed the Hartley Pediatric Trauma Unit after Major O'Brien declined the honor. The unit board now displayed her commendation alongside the department's updated protocols, her field techniques adapted for civilian emergency medicine. Daniel Hartley, 7 years old and fully recovered, ran through the hospital gardens with the speed of a child who'd learned the value of moving. His hearing aids, perfectly calibrated post-recovery by a specialist the hospital had brought in specifically for him, caught every sound: wind through the maples, his own breathing, the footsteps behind him on the brick pathway. Colonel Hartley watched from a bench, the limp from Marja finally fading, his face carrying the peace of a man whose son had been returned to him. And then Daniel stopped. He turned toward the woman in the restored scrubs walking toward them, the late afternoon sun catching the chain around her neck, a dog tag, welded whole again, the broken links fused into a single unbroken symbol. Megan O'Brien knelt as Daniel ran toward her, and the child crashed into her arms with the full force of a 7-year-old's gratitude. He lifted off the ground, light in her hands, signing rapidly with his small fingers, his joy making the signs imprecise but unmistakable. "You came back, you came back, you came back." She laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded in a way that made Colonel Hartley's eyes water. She set Daniel down and signed back, "I'm not leaving again." The unit's break room had been transformed. Sarah and Jennifer sat together during shift change, and when Megan came in, they looked up with warmth instead of the cold silence of before. The 10 doctors who declared Daniel unsavable had requested to observe her teaching rounds. She conducted them every Thursday evening now, reviewing trauma protocols, sharing techniques from her years in the field, saving civilian lives with the knowledge she'd been forced to hide. But there was one corner of the hospital where nothing had been redeemed. The night security desk in the main lobby. It was staffed by a man in an ill-fitting uniform, checking visitor badges with hands that trembled slightly, even at rest. Dr. Marcus Caldwell had taken the position 3 months into his termination, when legal action against him had consumed his savings and his reputation had been permanently altered by the simple, undeniable facts of what he'd done. He'd made calls to ensure no hospital in a 50-mile radius would hire him as a physician. He'd burned bridges with colleagues who'd once supported him. He worked nights because he couldn't handle the daylight traffic of staff he'd once commanded. He checked visitor badges because it was the only work available to someone with his particular combination of credentials and notoriety. A family walked past his desk, he recognized them from his surgery days. They didn't recognize him. His eyes followed them to the elevators, then dropped back to the logbook he was supposed to be filling out. A visitor approached for a badge, and Caldwell's hands trembled as he wrote the name in the log, his signature no longer the confident slash it once had been but something smaller, more constrained. The final evening light was turning the parking lot to amber. Megan walked Daniel and Colonel Hartley toward their vehicle, the three of them moving with the ease of people who'd survived something together. Daniel asked a question in sign language, his hands forming the shapes with careful precision, his question urgent and sincere. Colonel Hartley translated for the moment, his voice soft. He wants to know if you'll teach him to be brave like you. Megan knelt to Daniel's level, her eyes meeting his directly. She signed slowly so he could read every movement. True class is what you do when the lights go out. And you're already braver than I ever was. They stood. They walked to their car. Megan stood watching them leave, the afternoon sun warm on her face, the dog tag chain around her neck catching the light like a benediction. Behind her, the hospital rose against the darkening sky. Inside that building, lives were being saved and lost and held in balance. Inside that building, she would return tomorrow and the day after that, finally visible after years of hiding, finally able to use her hands and her knowledge and her hard-won experience openly, without apology, without fear. The broken chain made whole. The buried rank restored. The call sign that had survived erasure now trending on every platform, a reminder that heroes don't always look like the people in charge, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. If you made it this far, you already know you need to subscribe. You probably know someone in medicine, in military service, in witness protection, someone living a story they can't tell. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And if Major O'Brien showed up at your hospital, would you have believed a nurse over 10 doctors? Tell us. We're listening.